The wagon had been traveling since before first light, and by the time it crested the long ridge above the Harlan Valley, the sun had climbed just high enough to turn the snow-dusted peaks of the Bitterroot Range a shade of pale, burning gold. May Calloway sat on the bench beside the driver, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes taking in everything: the wide, frost-bitten meadows, the dark line of pine forest along the foothills, the silver thread of a creek catching the morning light below. Montana Territory. She had heard the name spoken mostly in two ways, with longing or with warning. She had arrived with neither. She had arrived with a leather satchel, a wool coat that was one season past its usefulness, and a rolled tube of papers bound with a strip of cord. Those papers were the only thing of value she still possessed: her teaching certificates, her letters of reference, and tucked between them, a copy of a contract she had memorized so thoroughly she could recite it in her sleep. The driver, a lean man from Missoula who communicated almost entirely through the movement of his jaw, pulled the team to a slow halt at the bottom of the valley road. He pointed with his chin toward a cluster of buildings set back against a low rise of land. A ranch house, two barns, a series of fenced paddocks running east toward the creek. It was a working place, built for endurance rather than beauty. The timber was dark with age and weather, the roof lines clean and practical. A water tower stood at the edge of the nearest paddock, and beyond it, stretching far to the north, cattle moved like slow brown clouds across the pale winter grass. Aldridge land, the driver said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken all morning. May stepped down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. She had learned that lesson the hard way, in a succession of situations where waiting had cost her more than the help had been worth. She retrieved her satchel from the back of the wagon, adjusted her coat, and stood for a moment in the cold, clean air. A hawk turned in a slow circle overhead, riding an updraft off the ridge with absolute, unhurried confidence. She watched it for a moment. Then she walked toward the house. The man who answered the door was not what she had expected, though she was honest enough with herself to admit that she hadn't known what to expect. Garrett Aldridge was somewhere in his early 40s, broad through the chest, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and hands that told the full story of his life without a single word needing to be spoken. He looked at her, the way men out here often looked at things that didn't quite fit the landscape, not unkindly, but with a careful, measuring attention. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was even, neither warm nor cold. "Mr. Aldridge." She met his gaze without flinching. "I believe you received my letter." He had. She knew he had, because the letter from his foreman had come back to her in Missoula within the week. 2 short lines, confirming the position and the terms. A schoolteacher, the Valley's only one-room school having shuttered 2 months prior when the county pulled its funding, arriving to serve as a tutor for his ward, a girl of 11 named Iris, in exchange for room, board, and a modest wage that would allow May to begin repaying the debt her father had left behind when he died. $47 and some change, owed to a man named Prescott at the general store in Calder Creek. It was not a large sum by some measures. By hers, it had become the architecture of her daily life. "The arrangement stands," Garrett said, stepping back from the door to let her in. He did not offer to take her satchel. "Iris has her lessons in the mornings. The rest of your time is yours to manage the household as you see fit." He paused. "She hasn't spoken much since her mother passed. I want you to know that before you meet her." May nodded. She did not offer false reassurances. She simply filed the information away in the careful, organized space of her mind where useful things were stored. The kitchen was large and cold in the way of rooms that hadn't had a woman's consistent attention in some time. Clean enough, a man's clean, all surfaces wiped but corners overlooked, windows hazed with a winter's worth of wood smoke. A cast-iron stove stood against the far wall, and May had a fire going in it within 20 minutes of arriving. By the time she heard small footsteps on the stairs, the kettle was on, and the room had already begun to soften with heat. Iris appeared in the doorway like something cautious and half-wild. She had her guardian's dark coloring and a face that was still mostly childhood, with large, watchful eyes that moved over May with an intelligence that was startling in its directness. She said nothing. She simply stood and looked and waited. "I'm May," May said. She didn't crouch down or soften her voice the way adults sometimes did with grieving children, as though sadness required a different register. She spoke the same way she would have spoken to anyone. "I'll be here in the mornings. We can start tomorrow, if that suits you." Something in Iris's expression shifted, just slightly. Not warmth, not yet, but an absence of hostility, which May recognized as a beginning. The first week passed in the rhythm of new work. Mornings were for lessons at the kitchen table reading, figures, a geography of the world beyond these mountains that Iris received with a quiet, fierce concentration. Afternoons were for the house, which May moved through with a steady, methodical attention, bringing it back to order one room at a time. Evenings, after Iris was settled with a book, May sat at the table in the lamplight and made a habit of reviewing the household accounts. It was not her assigned task, but the ledger had been left open on the shelf above the sideboard, and the first time she'd glanced at it while looking for a dishcloth, the numbers had reached out and seized her attention like a hand closing around her wrist. Garrett Aldridge ran his cattle operation on instinct and experience, both of which were considerable. What he did not run it on was paper. The accounts were a tangle of crossed-out figures and margin notes, receipts tucked between pages without any system she could identify, expenses logged in one hand and income in another, as though they belonged to separate and entirely unrelated stories. He was not careless. She could see, in the bones of the thing, that he understood his land deeply, but the numbers that governed the land, those he had been avoiding with the determination of a man who preferred not to know the precise shape of a problem he couldn't solve with his hands. May began quietly. A blank page in the back of the book. Dates in one column, figures in another. She did not announce what she was doing. She simply did it, the way she did everything, with focus and without requiring an audience. It was on a Thursday evening, 11 days after her arrival, that she found the first thing that didn't belong. She had been working through the cattle sale records for the previous year, a single buyer handling all transactions, a man named Doyle Fitch who operated out of a trading post on the far edge of Calder Creek. The prices he'd paid per head were recorded in Garrett's own hand, and they were, at a glance, unremarkable. But May had grown up at the edge of the ranching world, her father having worked as a land agent for 15 years before illness took the business out from under him, and she knew enough to sense when figures were sitting just slightly wrong. Like a table with one leg trimmed a quarter-inch too short, nothing you could see immediately, but everything you felt when you rested your weight on it. She pulled out the notation she had made from a newspaper left in the Missoula post office, a printed summary of cattle market averages for the previous season across the territory. She set it beside the Aldridge ledger. She began to compare. By midnight, she had her answer. Fitch had been paying Garrett Aldridge between 8 and 14 cents below market value per head for 22 months. On any individual sale, the difference was small enough to dismiss as fluctuation. Across dozens of transactions and hundreds of animals, it amounted to just over $300 that should have been in Garrett's pocket and wasn't. May set her pen down and looked at the lamp flame for a long moment. Then she found the second thing. It was tucked inside the back cover of the ledger, folded small a notice from the First Territorial Bank of Calder Creek. A mortgage, 3 years old, on the 200 acres of north pasture that Garrett had added to the original Aldridge land when he'd first brought Iris here. The annual payment was due in 41 days. The amount was $360. The signature at the bottom of the notice, as branch officer of the First Territorial Bank, was a name she had to read twice before it settled. Warren Fitch, Doyle Fitch's older brother. She sat very still at the kitchen table in the late quiet of the ranch house, the lamplight small and steady around her, and felt the particular cold anger of a person who has just seen, in complete clarity, how a trap was built. The cattle broker had been bleeding the ranch for nearly 2 years, trimming each sale just enough to avoid notice, feeding the shortfall back to a bank that his own brother controlled. a bank that was now positioned to receive a payment Garrett Aldridge could not make, because the money that should have covered it had been quietly redirected out of his hands. It was patient work. It was predatory work. It was the kind of scheme that relied on a busy man looking at his land instead of his ledger, on the reasonable assumption that no one in this household was watching. That assumption had been wrong for 11 days now. May was calm when she decided what she needed to do. She was always calm when she was working. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from her own satchel and began to write 3 letters. The first went to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, requesting the recorded deed history on the North Pasture parcel. The second went to a cattle auctioneer in Billings she knew by name from her father's correspondence, asking for the printed average sale prices for the past 24 months. The third was to a land attorney in Missoula, a man named Greer who had once done a fair piece of work for her father, asking a carefully phrased question about whether a creditor who had also acted as the debtor's sole sales broker during the period of debt accumulation bore any legal liability for the accuracy of that representation. She folded the letters and sealed them. Then she banked the stove, trimmed the lamp, and went to bed. She had done what could be done in one night. Morning would bring what it brought. Garrett noticed the following day. He came in before dawn, as he always did, and she already had the coffee on, and he stopped when he saw his ledger open on the table beside a sheet of her own careful figures. He stood looking at it the way a man stands looking at something that has been placed in his path, not in his way exactly, but directly enough that he cannot pretend not to see it. He poured his coffee. He sat down. He looked at what she had written, and he did not speak for a long time. "I need to send those letters with the next rider into town," May said, her voice carrying the same even tone she used for everything. She was slicing bread at the counter, not looking at him. "When does he come through?" Garrett said nothing for another moment. Then, "Tomorrow morning, early." "Good." He was quiet for so long that she thought he was done. Then he said, "How long have you been looking at these numbers?" "Since the second evening," May said. "I wasn't looking for anything. I just saw the book sitting open." Another silence. "What do you see?" he asked. His voice was careful, in the way of a man who has been hurt by surprises and has learned to approach them slowly. She turned then, and she laid out what she had found. She did not soften it or build to it. She simply stated it, clearly, in order. The underpriced sales, the cumulative loss, the bank notice, the shared surname of the broker and the bank officer, and her own assessment of what those facts, taken together, most likely represented. She spoke the way she taught, directly, expecting the person across from her to be capable of handling what was true. She watched his face while she spoke. She watched the stillness that settled over him, the particular quality of a man absorbing something that confirms a dread he had been refusing to name. "I thought Fitch was doing me a favor," he said finally. "Taking the whole herd at once. Saved me the drive to Billings." "That's what he needed you to think," May said. She said it without accusation. It was simply the mechanism of the thing predators required the cooperation of their prey's assumptions. Garrett looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at her. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to let me handle the correspondence," May said. "And I need you to say nothing to Fitch or to anyone at that bank until I hear back." He nodded. Once. The way men out here nodded when a thing had been decided. The reply from Billings came first. 9 days later. The average prices confirmed everything she had calculated. She added the figures to her record and set the letter aside. 3 days after that, a brief response from the attorney in Missoula arrived, cautious, as attorneys always were, but clear enough between its careful lines to indicate that yes, a broker with a material financial interest in an opposing party could indeed bear liability for the accuracy of the prices they reported, particularly if those prices could be demonstrated to have been systematically below market for a sustained period. She had built her case. Now she needed to use it. The opportunity came on a morning when Garrett and his hand had ridden out before sunup to pull a section of fence that the early November freeze had shifted. May was in the yard splitting kindling, methodical and unhurried, when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see a man riding in with the easy, over-familiar confidence of someone accustomed to arriving where he was not invited and finding it acceptable. Doyle Fitch was younger than she'd imagined him, mid-30s, with an expensive coat and the smooth, unworked hands of a man who bought and sold things rather than made them. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has just found a minor inconvenience where they expected an unobstructed path. "I'm here for Aldridge," he said, not dismounting. He did not tip his hat. May set her hatchet down on the splitting block. She took off her work gloves, folded them, and tucked them into her coat pocket. She did all of this at the pace she chose. "He's not available," she said. "I handle the accounts. If you have ranch business, you have it with me." Fitch's expression moved from mild impatience to something closer to amusement. He swung down from his horse, though not as a concession, more as a man who prefers to conduct his condescension at eye level. "I'm here about the North Pasture note. The payment's coming due in a few weeks, and my brother at the bank has asked me to come by. We've got an offer, take some cattle off his hands at a fair price. Help him make the payment. Simple as that." "How much per head?" May asked. Something shifted in his face, just slightly. "It's a fair price." "I'm sure it is," May said. "About 12 cents below Billings market average, I'd estimate. Same as the last 22 months. The silence that followed had a particular texture. She had experienced it before, in smaller versions, the silence of a person who has just realized they are not in the conversation they thought they were in. Fitch looked at her with entirely different eyes now. "I don't know what you think you've found." May walked to the porch and returned with her satchel. She opened it and removed 3 items: the page of her calculations, the letter from the Billings auctioneer, and the attorney's response from Missoula. She laid them on the top rail of the paddock fence between them. She did not accuse him. She did not raise her voice. She was a teacher, and teachers knew that the most devastating thing you could do with evidence was simply to present it and wait. "Mr. Aldridge will not be using your brokerage services going forward," she said, in the same tone she might have used to explain long division. "His cattle will be sold directly through auction in Billings next spring. As for the outstanding discrepancy in the prices you reported over the past 2 years, I've drafted a letter to your brother at the bank explaining the situation and requesting that the difference, $312, be credited against the North Pasture mortgage balance before the payment. Date." She let that sit for a moment. That would, conveniently, cover the shortfall entirely. Fitch stared at the papers. He was not a stupid man, which was both his problem and hers. A stupid man might have blundered forward, given her more to work with. An intelligent one recognized the end of a game when it was placed directly in front of him. "You can't prove." "I can demonstrate a consistent and documented pattern," May said. "Whether that rises to a legal standard would be a question for the territorial court. I imagine your brother would prefer to avoid the question being asked at all. Most people in his position do." Fitch stood very still for a long moment. A magpie called from somewhere in the tree line. The horses in the paddock moved and blew steam in the cold air. "This isn't finished," he said, finally. His voice had gone thin and tight. "For you it is," May said quietly. "Good morning, Mr. Fitch." She gathered the papers, replaced them in her satchel, and went back to splitting kindling. She heard him mount up. She heard the horse move away at a hard pace. She did not watch him go. Her hands were steady. She had known, somewhere in the careful architecture of herself, that this moment was coming from the night she'd first read his name in the ledger. She had simply been patient. Garrett came home at dusk and read the tracks in the frozen yard. He came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway, and May set dinner on the table and told him what had happened with the same plain-spoken clarity she used for everything. She watched him sit with it, the way he sat with things still and deep, like a stone settling in clear water. He asked about the letter to the bank. She showed him the draft. He read it twice and handed it back. "Send it," he said. She sent it the following morning. The reply came 10 days before the mortgage was due. Warren Fitch, it appeared, had no appetite for a territorial court inquiry into his brother's brokerage practices. The letter from the bank was formal and brief and contained, Buried inside its careful phrasing, a credit against the note balance in the amount of $310. Combined with what Garrett had on hand, he would make the payment with $6 to spare. She read the letter twice, and then set it in the center of the kitchen table, where he would find it when he came in. What followed was different. The sharpest edges of the arrangement wore smooth. Garrett began bringing his questions to her in the evenings, not just about the accounts, but about the land, about decisions that balanced against each other. He had spent years being a man who solved problems alone out of necessity rather than preference, and the relief of having someone to think alongside was visible in him in the way that relief always is, in people who have been quietly exhausted for a long time. Iris changed, too. It happened slowly, the way the good things do. By the third week of lessons, she had begun to ask questions, small ones first, about words in a sentence, about a place on the map, then larger ones, the kind that have no tidy answer. One morning she came in from the paddock where she had been watching May work with one of the young horses and said, very quietly, "He trusts you." She was talking about the horse. She may have been talking about other things. May had looked at her for a moment, this fierce and watchful child who had been carrying her grief like something too fragile to set down. "Most things do," May said. "Once they know you'll be straight with them." Iris considered that for a long time. After that, the silences between them were different. The first snow of real winter came in mid-December, and with it a quietness over the valley that felt like permission to stop moving and notice what was around. Garrett and May took to sitting at the kitchen table after Iris was in bed, at first reviewing the spring plans, the cattle drive schedule, the account projections she had laid out for the coming year. Then, gradually, other conversations about the land, about the territory, which would be entering statehood soon, about what she had wanted to do before circumstances had redirected her path. "You are going to open a school," he said one evening. Not a question. He had been listening more carefully than she'd realized. "I was," she said. She looked at the lamp flame. "I still might. Not much call for leaving, if the school's here," he said. He said it carefully, the way a man says a thing he has been carrying quietly for some time. "There's enough children in this valley. I'd help you build it." He paused. "And I'd like you to stay, May. Not as an employee." He looked at her directly, the way he always did, gray eyes steady. "As my wife, if that's a thing you'd consider." May looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She had known this was coming, the way, a season is turning, not suddenly, but in an accumulation of small signs, each one barely significant on its own. She had been, she realized, waiting for him to arrive at it in his own time. "I consider it very carefully considered," she said. And then, because she had never seen the purpose in prolonging the obvious, yes, he smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that started in the eyes before it reached anywhere else. She thought it might be the most honest thing she had seen in a very long time. They were married in February, in the small church in Calder Creek, on a bright, cold morning when the snow on the peaks was a blinding white against a sky, the deep, particular blue that only comes in winter at altitude. Iris stood beside May in a dress they had made together, her expression solemn and proud. She held May's hand during the vows with a grip that was absolutely certain. That was what the friends and neighbors who gathered in the church that day would remember later, the girl holding the woman's hand as though she had always known this was where it would come to rest. 6 years on, the valley was a different place, and the same one. The Aldridge Ranch ran larger and cleaner than it ever had, the accounts kept with a precision that had become the quiet legend of Calder Creek. Garrett had built the schoolhouse in the second year, a sturdy one-room building at the edge of the East Meadow with 4 windows and a good stove, and May taught there 3 mornings a week through the school season, 14 children at various stages of learning how the world was organized. It was not the grand school she had once imagined. It was better, it was real, and it was needed, and it was hers. On a late autumn evening, with the last light fading over the Bitterroot Peaks and the smell of wood smoke drifting from the house, May sat on the porch steps with Iris, 17 now, with her guardian's steadiness and something entirely her own in her eyes watching Garrett walk in from the north paddock, with their two younger children tumbling around his feet. A boy of 5 and a girl of 3, both of them loud in the way of children who have never been afraid. "Do you remember Fitch?" Iris asked, out of nowhere. May thought about it. "Not often," she said honestly. Iris was quiet for a moment. "He was so certain," she said, "that there was nothing here worth taking seriously." May looked at the ranch, at the solid fences, the full barn, the lamplight beginning to glow in the kitchen window, at Garrett, lifting the small girl onto his shoulders while the boy hung from his arm, laughing. "He came looking for something to take," May said. "He didn't understand what he was looking at." Iris nodded slowly, the way she absorbed things that were true. Garrett reached the porch steps and looked up at the two of them with that same unhurried, steadying gaze that May had met for the first time on a frozen November morning when she had stepped off a wagon with a satchel and a debt and very little else. "Cold coming," he said. "It always does," May said. She stood and took the small girl from his shoulders. The child curled against her with the complete, unself-conscious trust of the very young. "Come inside. Dinner's on." They went in together, all of them, into the warmth. That is the thing about the women who built the West, alongside the men who are remembered for it. They rarely arrived with anything as visible as a weapon or a deed. They arrived with competence and steadiness, and the particular courage of a person who understands that the most powerful thing in any room is often the one holding the books. May Calloway had come to the Harlan Valley, asking for nothing more than a roof and a chance to repay what her father owed. What she had built there in the ledger columns, in the schoolroom, in the heart of a quiet man who had nearly lost everything to people counting on his not looking closely enough, that was something no one had ever been able to take back from her. She had not come to be rescued. She had come to work. The rest had simply followed, the way good things do. When you do the work honestly and you do not look away. Thank you for spending this time with me, friends. It means more than you know. Until next time, keep your accounts honest and your fires warm. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can bring to a hard situation isn't money or muscle. It's the willingness to look clearly at what others have been too busy or too afraid to see. May didn't save the ranch by being extraordinary. She saved it by showing up, doing the work honestly, and refusing to look away. That kind of steadiness is available to all of us, and it changes more than we know. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted with the intention of bringing you a moment of warmth and entertainment, alongside a small lesson worth carrying into your day.